Welcome to our channel. Before we get started, please consider liking and subscribing so we can bring more stories like this to you. I never expected a single signature on a lease agreement to turn my life so completely upside down. The day I met Valerie Jenkins was a crisp spring afternoon, and I remember feeling a sense of relief that my long house hunting ordeal might finally be over. Freshly divorced with 2 grown daughters out of the house, I was looking for a small bungalow to rent in a quiet neighborhood. Ms. Jenkins's property, tucked away on a neat suburban lane, seemed a perfect fit: a single-story brick facade, a little garden out back, and a garage for my old but reliable Honda. When I first greeted her in the driveway, she wore a cheery smile that revealed a glint of gold on her front tooth, a tiny detail, but it struck me as oddly memorable. She introduced herself as a retired librarian who managed a few rentals around town. "I keep a tight ship," she said, "but I'm fair if my tenants follow the rules." That sounded reasonable enough, and I was too tired from weeks of searching to question it. She showed me the interior: hardwood floors in the living room, freshly painted walls, and a kitchen that had the vintage charm I loved: checkerboard linoleum and those old-fashioned cabinets built in the 1950s. It all felt bright and open, almost hopeful. The rent was on the higher side, but Ms. Jenkins brushed off my concerns. "I haven't raised rent in years," she insisted. "You're actually getting a bargain." And with a practiced wave of her hand, she ushered me toward the dining room window to admire the view of a rosebush in full bloom. I signed the lease that same day, eager to move on with my life. Ms. Jenkins was meticulous with the paperwork. She pulled out a thick folder of documents and, pen poised, made me initial every line. I noticed some unusual clauses in the fine print: things about quiet hours, mandated lawn care schedules, and her right to inspect the premises to ensure the dignity of the neighborhood. But after the emotional roller coaster of my divorce, I just wanted stability. I told myself it was normal for a landlord to be thorough. The first few weeks in my new home were peaceful. Ms. Jenkins would occasionally text me about small things: trash day reminders or a friendly note about watering the flowers out front. I figured it was her way of being helpful. She was, after all, my landlord and lived only 2 streets away. I had no reason to believe her interest was anything more than neighborly concern. However, I soon found her presence creeping in at unexpected moments. On a Saturday morning, I emerged from the shower to find Ms. Jenkins standing in my backyard, staring intently at the rosebush. She wore gardening gloves and had a small set of clippers in her hand. When I slid open the back door to ask what she was doing, she stiffened, as if surprised. "These roses needed pruning," she explained, "and I do it for all my rentals. Keeps the property value up." I didn't want to seem ungrateful, but it was unsettling that she hadn't asked. She just shrugged it off. "I have the right to enter for maintenance. Section 12.3 of the lease. You signed it." And with that, she marched away, plastic bag of clippings swinging at her side. Over the next few days, little notes began appearing under my front door. At first, they were innocuous: "Please close the blinds when you're away, direct sunlight can fade the hardwood." Then they escalated in tone: "Heard your TV at 10 p.m. on a weeknight, quiet hours start at 9. Every time I found one, it left my stomach in knots. I'd never had a landlord quite so involved, almost fixated, on each tiny detail of my life. Worse yet, she seemed to be monitoring my comings and goings. One evening, I returned from a friend's birthday dinner to see Ms. Jenkins parked across the street in her sedan, head bowed as though checking her phone. The next morning, there was another slip of paper on my doorstep, referencing late-night visitors. I was alone last night. Did she mean my rideshare driver? When I asked a neighbor about Ms. Jenkins, they let out a resigned laugh. "You've got yourself one of the biggest busybodies in the entire county. She's always prided herself on keeping standards high. If it's not the color of your curtains, it's the length of your grass." Apparently, she was well known for filing petty complaints at City Hall and sending stern letters to local residents, whether she owned their property or not. I tried to brush it off. My plan was to keep my head down, pay rent on time, and avoid any direct confrontations. But something in Ms. Jenkins's gaze when she dropped off another note, this time about a small smudge on my driveway, told me I should prepare for a far bigger headache than just a too intense landlord. Little did I know that my future held a chaos that would spill into legal threats, police involvement, and a confrontation I'd only ever seen dramatized in TV reruns. This sweet retired librarian would soon make every day of my tenancy a waking nightmare. 2 months in, the situation went from unnerving to intolerable. By then, I had 3 giant envelopes stuffed with Ms. Jenkins's letters. They ranged from petty requests, like how many potted plants I could keep on the porch, to borderline threatening remarks about severe consequences if I didn't keep the hedge trimmed to her standards. She claimed it was all within the lease agreement, some hidden subclause about exterior aesthetics. One morning, just as I was juggling my grocery bags on the porch, she appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. I nearly dropped a carton of eggs when she started lecturing me about the dangers of letting cats roam free. This was strange for 2 reasons. First, I don't own a cat. Second, I'd never once seen a feline near my house. I told her calmly that she must be mistaken. She just narrowed her eyes and insisted she'd heard meowing, as if that alone justified her presence on my property. It became impossible to predict Ms. Jenkins's next move. I tried texting her, politely requesting advance notice before she entered the yard, but she wouldn't respond. Instead, she'd leave more scribbled messages about refusing to cooperate. Once, she stepped onto my porch while I was at work, inspected my power meter, and then accused me of tampering with it because my electric bill was too low to be honest. Ridiculous as it was, she threatened to report me to the local utility company. I called them myself to clarify the matter, and they brushed it off as nonsense. Around that time, a suspiciously timed maintenance check occurred in my bathroom. Ms. Jenkins claimed she needed to replace the shower head due to a city directive. I'd never heard of such a requirement and was sure no official notice had arrived. Nevertheless, I tried to accommodate her and picked a day she could come over while I was home. But Ms. Jenkins insisted she could only do it on a Tuesday morning, when she knew I'd be at work. I asked a friend to house sit, not comfortable with Ms. Jenkins being there alone. The next day, my friend reported that Ms. Jenkins had shown up, rummaged through my bathroom cabinets, looking for the water valve, she said, and then left in a hurry when questioned. No shower head was replaced. My friend also noticed Ms. Jenkins's phone was out, as if she'd been filming or taking photos. The entire ordeal was bizarre and unsettling. I didn't know what to do but keep documenting every incident. Things intensified when Ms. Jenkins began recruiting other neighbors into her crusade. The elderly couple across the street, who rarely left their home, suddenly complained about the color of my porch light. "You might attract undesirable elements," the husband told me. When I asked what elements he was talking about, he hemmed and hawed until he admitted Ms. Jenkins had come by to warn them I was associating with questionable folks. I was astounded. My only visitors were my daughters and a few church friends. Feeling cornered, I decided to check the local tenant laws. I discovered that Ms. Jenkins's unannounced visits likely violated my rights. Furthermore, many of her demands were unenforceable, especially if they weren't explicitly in the lease. As Ms. Jenkins ramped up her intrusions, I realized I might need to involve a third party, maybe a mediator or a tenants association, if it came to it. The final straw of this phase came on a Friday evening. I was inside, enjoying a quiet night of reading, when flashing red and blue lights lit up my windows. My heart pounded as I saw 2 police officers approach my front door. They knocked politely, and when I opened it, they asked if I was conducting an event with loud music. Baffled, I assured them I was home alone, reading. My TV was off, radio silent. They seemed embarrassed. One officer even glanced toward Ms. Jenkins's house down the street and sighed. "It's probably a false call," the officer admitted. "We've received noise complaints from this address before, but we never find any actual disturbance." Then he asked if everything was all right, noticing how shaken I was. I told him about my landlord's pattern of harassment. He handed me a card with the non-emergency line and advised me to document everything. After they left, I stood in the silence of my living room, staring at the dark silhouette of Ms. Jenkins's bungalow in the distance. My phone buzzed, another message from her: "You can't fool the cops forever. I know what you're really doing in there." My blood ran cold. I realized this wasn't just about petty property disputes. Ms. Jenkins was on a mission to make my life miserable, and she was weaponizing the police to do it. I knew I needed legal backup, but I also knew Ms. Jenkins thrived on confrontation. The question was, how far was she willing to go, and how much proof did I need before someone would step in and stop her? I spent that weekend assembling every scrap of evidence I had, the text messages, the anonymous notes, all of which had her unmistakable scrawl, and a log detailing every time she set foot on my property unannounced. I even had the times and dates of her bizarre maintenance checks, along with my friend's statement about catching her snooping. If she wanted to push this to some extreme, I'd be ready. By Monday, I mustered the courage to email Ms. Jenkins a concise, polite but firm warning that her behavior constituted harassment. I CC'd a local tenants' rights organization to make it clear I wasn't bluffing. That evening, she arrived on my doorstep as if summoned by my challenge. She looked furious, cheeks flushed red, eyes blazing behind her glasses. "You think you can threaten me?" she hissed before I could even say hello. "I've been in this business for 20 years. I know every judge and code inspector in this county. You out of line." Then she handed me what looked like an eviction notice, printed on generic stationery, no official letterhead or anything. "This is your final warning," she said. "I'm terminating your lease for violating the peaceful enjoyment clause. You've been bringing disruptive guests, ignoring property standards, and disrespecting me as a landlord." Her voice trembled with anger. I glanced at the so-called notice. It was riddled with spelling errors and had zero references to actual legal statutes. My chest tightened. Whether it was legitimate or not, she just escalated things. I informed her calmly that I would not be leaving. She sputtered something about, "You'll regret this," before stomping away. I called my older daughter, Catherine, for emotional support. She advised me to contact the police if Ms. Jenkins threatened me again. "She's not invincible," Catherine said. "And from the sound of it, she's crossing serious boundaries." I had some hope that maybe Ms. Jenkins would back off once she realized I wasn't easily intimidated. But that hope vanished 2 days later. Wednesday morning, I stepped outside to find the windshield of my Honda covered in a neon orange sticker that read "Tow Notice." Ms. Jenkins was hovering nearby, along with a tow truck operator. She claimed my car was illegally parked on private property. Exasperated, I pointed to the driveway, my rightful parking space per the lease. The tow truck driver was clearly confused too. He flipped through his paperwork, realized Ms. Jenkins had no evidence of wrongdoing, and left without charging her. She was livid. That afternoon, I received a curt email from Ms. Jenkins. "The clock is ticking. You have 72 hours to vacate." Again, no legal basis, but the sheer barrage of hostility was wearing me down. I took all my documents to a local law clinic, where a volunteer attorney confirmed my suspicions. Ms. Jenkins was in violation of multiple tenant protection laws. Her unauthorized entry alone could merit a lawsuit. The attorney drafted a formal cease and desist letter, which I mailed via certified post. Then came the night that sealed our showdown. Around 10 p.m., I was awakened by a crashing sound in the backyard. Heart pounding, I peered out my bedroom window to see Ms. Jenkins shining a flashlight by my trash bins. She was ranting loudly, cursing under her breath. Before I could even dial the police, she banged on my back door. "Open up," she shouted. "You've been dumping toxic materials. I saw the bottles." My mind reeled. The only trash I'd thrown out was an old container of cleaning solution that had expired, nothing remotely toxic in the sense she implied. I called the non-emergency number the officer had given me, explaining Ms. Jenkins's trespassing and false accusations. Within minutes, a patrol car arrived. 2 officers calmly listened to both of us. Ms. Jenkins insisted she was performing a health and safety inspection, brandishing her flashlight like a badge of authority. One officer quietly asked for her official documentation or reason to suspect a health code violation. She had none. They escorted her off my property, warning her that she could be charged with trespassing if she continued this behavior. That incident was my tipping point. I decided to pursue a restraining order or, at the very least, a protective order that would prevent Ms. Jenkins from entering my space without proper legal cause. The volunteer attorney guided me through the steps, and I filed the necessary paperwork at the courthouse the next day. Hearing the clerk read my statement out loud felt surreal. Landlord repeatedly harasses tenant, enters property unannounced, makes false police reports. It sounded like a story from the news, not my everyday life. A hearing was scheduled for the following week to determine whether an immediate protective order was warranted. If granted, Ms. Jenkins could face legal consequences for so much as stepping onto my driveway unannounced. A part of me felt victorious. Another part was terrified. If she was this unhinged before, what would she do when the law officially stood in her way? The day of the court hearing arrived with a dreary drizzle that seemed to mirror my mood. Even though it was a smaller county courthouse, the gravitas of entering those doors, passing through the security check, and waiting on a wooden bench made it all feel overwhelming. I was there with my volunteer attorney, Ms. Delaney, clutching a folder of meticulously collected evidence. Ms. Jenkins arrived alone but strode through the hallway as though she owned the place. We stood before a magistrate in a modest hearing room. Ms. Delaney presented my evidence methodically, printouts of harassing text messages, photos of the neon tow notice Ms. Jenkins had slapped on my car, copies of the questionable eviction notices, and logs of police calls. Ms. Jenkins tried to interrupt multiple times, only to be silenced by the judge's stern gavel. When her turn came to speak, Ms. Jenkins launched into a tangled monologue about me being a danger to the community, claiming she had reasonable suspicion I was orchestrating wild parties or storing illegal substances. But she provided no proof. It was a litany of accusations with zero foundation. The judge's expression grew more incredulous by the minute. Finally, Ms. Jenkins admitted she hadn't followed proper legal channels for eviction. She also acknowledged she entered my property on multiple occasions without my permission. As if that weren't enough, Ms. Delaney produced a copy of the official city guidelines, verifying Ms. Jenkins's maintenance claims were completely fabricated. The judge asked Ms. Jenkins point-blank why she felt entitled to carry out late-night inspections and unauthorized searches. In a moment that seemed more theatrical than real, Ms. Jenkins, clearly flustered, declared, "I was protecting my investment." The judge ruled in my favor, granting a protective order barring Ms. Jenkins from coming onto the property without written notice, at least 48 hours in advance, and only for legitimate reasons like repairs. Furthermore, the judge warned Ms. Jenkins that any breach could result in charges of contempt of court. Her face went pale. She looked as though the ground had shifted under her feet. In the weeks that followed, Ms. Jenkins's harassment slowed. She no longer parked outside my home at odd hours, and the constant notes and texts ceased. But in a final, petty move, she refused to fix a broken hot water heater, which went out shortly after the court hearing. I filed yet another complaint, this time with the local housing authority. They issued a citation, forcing Ms. Jenkins to address the repair or face a hefty fine. She made the fix but did it through a surly third-party contractor who muttered under his breath the entire time. By now, my lease's end date was approaching. Despite the judge's order, I felt I couldn't truly relax. Every trip to the mailbox or glance at my phone gave me a jolt of anxiety, bracing for the next shoe to drop. Thankfully, Ms. Jenkins seemed cowed by the legal reality. When the day came to move out, I was worried about retrieving my security deposit. I even debated whether to take legal steps to ensure she wouldn't withhold it out of spite. Surprisingly, on my final walkthrough, Ms. Jenkins was almost cordial, although her forced smile never reached her eyes. She pointed out a small scuff on the living room wall, obviously fishing for an excuse to withhold part of my deposit. I calmly reminded her of the normal wear and tear laws. She didn't argue. We concluded the inspection with her handing me a check for the full amount, albeit with shaky hands. As I loaded the last box into my car, I looked at the bungalow one more time. I should have felt relief, maybe even joy, but instead, I felt drained. This little house that I'd hoped would be a fresh start after my divorce had become a battleground. Ms. Jenkins stood on the sidewalk, arms folded, glaring as though she was seeing me off to exile. After driving away, I pulled into a nearby parking lot and just breathed for a moment. The relief slowly crept in, mingled with the realization that, in the end, I'd stood my ground. I'd learned more about tenant law than I ever cared to know, and I'd discovered a well of resilience I didn't realize I had. For every snotty note or bogus police call Ms. Jenkins hurled my way, I had pressed forward, eventually holding her accountable in court. I later heard from neighbors that Ms. Jenkins tried to rent the bungalow to 3 different tenants in the months after I left, but each one backed out once they read online reviews or talked to folks in the neighborhood. There's some satisfaction in knowing word got around. Maybe Ms. Jenkins would think twice before harassing another tenant into sleepless nights. But I try not to dwell on her. Life is too short. I've since found a cozy apartment with a reasonable, respectful landlord. Sure, it's not as picturesque as that bungalow, but it's a place of true peace. I now share my story whenever I meet someone wrestling with difficult living conditions, especially single folks who can't just pick up and move at a moment's notice. My advice is always the same: know your rights, document everything, and never let someone bully you into giving up your peace of mind. It's easy for a landlord-tenant relationship to sour, but it's rarer for it to become a complete nightmare. Yet even in the worst of it, there are legal and community resources that can help you stand your ground. And if you're unlucky enough to encounter someone like Ms. Valerie Jenkins, a self-styled Karen with a mean streak, know that, with persistence and proper evidence, justice can prevail. After all, sometimes the best remedy to a nightmare is to shine the cold, steady light of the law upon it.